Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm delighted to welcome a well known professional from the world of management and leadership who's also an author from Illinois, USA, Casey LaFrance. Casey, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Casey is a project management and a change leadership expert, and he's an author. And all of you know I'm very partial to authors. He's an author of a book titled Targeting Discretion. So, Casey, my first question: what inspired your transition from a traditional project management to integrating AI and chatbot solutions?
I think my work in the nonprofit field is probably the greatest inspiration because in the nonprofit sector in the United States, we tend to see skeletal staff and a lot of reliance on soft funding, grants that may or may not be renewed, that sort of thing. And there's also a lot of paperwork because most of these services are being provided through contracts with governments that want to oversee and that sort of thing. And so there's a lot of paperwork, and what happens is that paperwork can get in the way of direct client interaction. So if we automate processes, and we're not talking about doing anything huge here, we're just talking about automating form generation and helping to expedite filling out those forms so that more time can be focused on the client. And the same in the classroom. So if I want to keep my material fresh, I can pull a case from the headlines and develop a simulation or a case study or an activity instantly and make my course topics more relevant. So we might be talking about some scholar that wrote in the 1990s or the early 2000s, but they can see the application in the moment, right? And I think that lines up with my research because my research is on decision making and discretion.
Mm,
And the idea is there isn't one best way. There's always been this debate in the management literature, especially in public administration.
mm,
How much control do we want to have over bureaucrats, right? How much do we want to make sure that they don't run afoul of legislation?
mm,
And then the other thing is, or the opposite, I guess, end of that continuum is how much discretion do we want to give them based on their expertise? Because the civil service system was set up to legitimate somebody in a position of authority based on their training, expertise, objective credentials, right?
mm.
And so, how do we reconcile that? And I think AI provides some answers, especially for streamlining the everyday stuff that gets in the way so that we can make more important decisions.
Right, right. Very interesting. And you had very diverse experience from academia, authorship, and innovation. How has this diverse experience shaped your approach to leadership?
I think the classroom has been fantastic. So I teach at Western Illinois University, and I'm the director of the graduate program in political science.
Mm,
I teach courses in public administration, nonprofit management. I have incredible colleagues and an incredibly supportive administration. But
mm,
what that's enabled me to do is bring students into the practitioner hands-on work that I'm doing with nonprofits and public agencies. And we can bring that stuff into the classroom and again show real life examples of theoretical concepts, and they can learn not just theory, but also tools, and hopefully be prepared for workplace situations that might evoke those sorts of decision opportunities, right? And future training.
yeah.
So I want them to leave my classroom with uh, the ability to take on some certification training and that sort of thing. But more broadly, so the classroom is a great agile experimental lab because I can try things out with them. I can generate ideas. I can create this culture where everybody feels this challenger level of psychological safety
Mm,
and they can contribute. And most importantly, they can critique my ideas in real
mm,
time.
mm,
Um, and so I've been working with Al Shalloway at Amplio University to develop those skills. And I've gotten a lot of training in disciplined agile, which is focused on using the appropriate way of working for the situation, which ties right back into discretion.
mhm.
So everything's kind of looped in together. It
Yeah,
ties into workforce development, improving the organization at the front line, the meso level, and the enterprise level.
wonderful. So let's now talk about an area of your specialization, which is project management and change leadership. How do you define effective project management, and what common pitfalls should leaders avoid?
So the answer to the first question, and keep in mind, my perspective is informed by primarily a public sector and nonprofit sector
Hmm.
orientation.
Yeah.
So my answer to the first question, defining a successful project, it kind of sounds like an easy way out, but it's the truth. And that answer is it depends, right?
Hmm.
Context matters a whole lot. Stakeholders matter.
Hmm.
Your evaluation criteria matter.
Hmm.
What I would say is we want metrics that aren't static,
Hmm.
right? Because we want continuous integration, continuous improvement. A lot of people think that when we conduct a program evaluation, that's the end and we go
Hmm.
home.
Hmm.
The reason that we do that, or the reason that we do retrospectives, is so that we can inform improvements in our processes, right?
Hmm.
And I would say integrating lean principles, right? Getting back to basics and talking about, hey, what does our value stream look like? What's in the way? How can
Yeah.
we improve it?
Hmm.
Um, and the 80-20 rule, right? The Pareto rule, where generally find that a lot of blockers are being caused by a few sources. And once we
Hmm.
identify those and get into some root cause analysis and take some actionable insight,
Yeah.
I think we can improve what we're doing.
Well said. Well said. And what would you say are some of the best practices to integrate AI into project management processes?
Well, again, starting at the very basic level, having some rudimentary training in what AI is and isn't. So there's a lot out there from the Project Management Institute, from the Management and Strategy Institute, from all
Hmm.
kinds of data bricks. There are all kinds of free training opportunities out there
Hmm.
to learn how to write prompts and to learn what you're doing with the prompt. But I think taking a step back and appreciating what an LLM is. And that doesn't mean you have to be a software engineer or an AI expert, but just taking a little bit of a step back and recognizing that what you're dealing with isn't a sentient creature, right? You're dealing with essentially a mirror of a sweep of the world's knowledge. And what we have to recall with that is due to a lot of historical factors, that knowledge tends to be primarily based on the Western canon. It tends to be overwhelmingly white and male. And we can see that just in everyday life. I have a friend who he's an African American gentleman, and when he goes to pick his kid up at the daycare, the face scanner doesn't recognize him. When the white parents go to pick their kids up, they're able to get in, right?
Wow.
So appreciating what it is and what it isn't, right? So it's not God in a box. It's not the Delphic Oracle. Uh, it's a representation of
Hmm.
uh, a relatively limited amount of the world's knowledge. And I think what we're seeing is it's improving, right? Especially ChatGPT.
Hmm.
It's improving through iteration and through interaction with people from the global south and from
Hmm.
other areas. But in order to facilitate that, we, of course, need to democratize internet access. So,
Correct. Correct. Great response. And Casey, how does AI-driven project management differ from traditional methods, especially in terms of efficiency and risk?
okay, so I would say that depends on the approach that you take. And there are a couple of different frameworks out there to guide us.
Hmm.
As a project manager, the one that stands out is PMI's Cognitive Project Management and AI model.
Hmm.
And there's a six-stage process associated with that. And it's very heavy on data and data analysis. So a lot of
Hmm.
that training has machine learning components. You learn about supervised and unsupervised learning, that sort of thing. And using that guide for deployment, I think you can reconcile that with some other models. And the one that I'm
Hmm.
thinking of is the IBM AI Ladder
Hmm.
for enterprise AI integration. So I think if you look at some models that are out there, and then getting back to the very basics, the absolute best training out there in prompt engineering would be Jules White's training from Vanderbilt University. There's a ton of Coursera courses he offers.
Hmm.
And then Jean Beatrix Law at Kennesaw State University has developed what she calls the rhetorical prompt model.
Hmm.
And that's based on her expertise in English and journalism. And so integrating principles of rhetoric into the prompt to give it a persona, to give it a role, to give it an expected outcome or a purpose, just little stuff like that on the front end. And then on the larger end, aligning your values with AI instead of letting AI drive the car and saying, hey, I have this. And in the nonprofit world, we see this not just with technologies, we see this with not with funding opportunities all the time. And there's a pretty well-known body of theory that results in this concept we call the hedgehog.
Hmm.
And the idea behind the hedgehog is you want to hold on to your hedgehog. Your hedgehog is a metaphor for your mission.
Hmm.
And a lot of times, what we'll see is there's a funding opportunity that might strain our mission or our identity as an organization. And we're not just talking about scope creep, we're talking about mission creep. We're talking about going in unprepared because we're chasing funds. And I think we can apply some of those lessons to AI. Just because a technology exists doesn't mean that we need to use it, right?
Hmm.
In the same way that face-to-face meetings will never be fully supplanted with online Zoom meetings, right?
Right, right.
There's still going to be a human element. There's still going to be human guidance. And
Hmm.
I think where we have to go, especially in education, is we have to take our heads out of the sand and stop being
Right,
afraid.
right.
Right? The job market right now is such that 74% of employers actively call for AI experience and skills.
Hmm.
50% of universities in America have policies that restrict the use of AI, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of that is the goal of any profession is to perpetuate that profession. And if we feel afraid, then of course that's our response. But if we see it as a tool that we can use to augment our abilities and make education richer and more contextually aware, I think we can see the future there.
Fascinating. And, a follow-up question to what you just said. What, in your view, is the future of AI-powered tools in education, and how might they reshape project management roles?
Well, I'm glad you asked that because I've seen a whole lot, and I'm currently working on a few projects with students. One that's fascinating, and I've incorporated it into my public policy seminar.
Hmm.
It's the idea of interviewing scholars from the past, right? So they conduct interviews with Jeremy Bentham, and all those caveats from before, of course, are
Yeah.
in place. You're not
Hmm.
talking directly to Bentham, but
Hmm.
it's a way for them to interact with the scholar in a more real time, lively, engaging way than simply reading the text, right?
Yeah.
And then I can show them Jeremy Bentham on display where he's taxidermied at Oxford and tell them they roll him out once a year and say he's present but not voting and that sort of stuff.
Hmm. Hmm.
So having that ability to tap into the scholars and ask them directly, right? Um, and the cool thing about that is you can examine that from all kinds of different perspectives. You can have Jeremy Bentham talk about regulatory policy or
Hmm.
AI or tariffs or whatever, right?
Hmm.
So that's one way. The other way is data analysis, right? We're able to do things in the classroom in real time that would have taken us a lot of time to build a data set and to run the numbers. We can instantly run OLS and logistic regressions on synthetic data sets that approximate previously published data. And
Hmm.
so if we have a question about a relationship, especially a causal one, we can conduct some analysis. And that isn't to provide the ultimate answer, of course, or to try
Hmm.
to prove anything, but it gets ideas flowing and it helps us to think about how we would operationalize those
Hmm.
variables and how we would measure them and what we're not accounting for. And so there's just so many
Yeah,
applications that are out
absolutely.
there, not just from the end user sort of LMS perspective, but real time case studies, real time quizzes.
Hmm.
We have it all at our fingertips right now. And I'm excited to go to class because I get to
Hmm.
do this stuff. So,
Absolutely. But the other aspect of AI is that how can one maintain human-centric management in projects that are increasingly being driven by AI?
well, I think it's with anything else, right? The technology is never going to replace the person,
Correct.
right? And there's some fascinating work that is going on with a company, I believe it's called Human Insight. And they are looking at, they have essentially what's called the human index.
Hmm.
And they're looking at facets of humanity that can't be replicated. And they actually give you an assessment and they tell you what features of your talents or skill sets can't be replaced by a machine. And a lot of those are things like empathy, right? Perspective, being able to see a balance. And I think that's where we're really in policy terms, in public administration. Like I said, it depends is the answer, and that doesn't always work with AI, right? AI wants, it's built on logic, or at least the
Correct.
approximation of logic. And so it wants there to be a right answer always.
Yeah.
And that's just not going to happen,
Mm.
right? There are always going to be trade-offs. We're always going to have to play in. And I think that's where my work on discretion, it really cascades from the larger question of accountability,
Yeah.
right? When we think about accountability, we often cast it as this dichotomous phenomenon. It's either present or absent.
Mm.
Ramzik and Dubnik wrote an article back in the 80s, and they were talking about the Challenger space shuttle
Yeah.
tragedy. And what they concluded is that accountability is multifaceted and multidimensional. So they
Mm.
came up with a two by two matrix where they look at bureaucratic accountability or accountability to orders and SOPs. And even there, we can see some potential for conflict. Right? We've all
Mm.
been given orders that conflict with what the policy manual says.
Correct. Correct.
There's legal accountability. Nobody wants to get sued. There's political accountability, and that means directly as a public agency to your
Mm.
funders, but also indirectly to your clients and
Mm.
stakeholders,
Yeah.
who are also, by the way, members of interest groups that lobby for you. So
Mm. Mm.
there's
Well said. Well
and
said.
then finally, professional accountability, and that's the realm of expertise and discretion. And so it's not a matter of, by virtue of demonstrating accountability to one of those dimensions, we are occluding the other one, right?
Mm.
And so what we have to think about is it's a menu. It's a series of options. And
Mm.
again, that's where discipline, agile, and discretion come in
Yeah.
because depending on the context, you might be oriented toward one or the other.
Yeah.
And it's also great for facilitating discussions between top level administrators in the C-suite and people on the front lines because they don't have the same lived experiences. And it's not that they need to have the same
Yeah.
priorities necessarily, but they ought to understand why the other has the priorities that they have.
Correct.
And I
Correct.
don't think AI is ever going to replace that.
Yeah. 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 That is true. Two more questions. Then I want to have ask you a question about your book. Uh, what is your view on the importance of evidence-based governance in project management?
I thought you were going to say evidence-based management, and and I was going to tell you, well, and I think there's some carryover from
Hmm.
Scrum's EBM model, right?
Hmm.
We want to find first off, what are our high level goals?
Hmm.
What's our strategy? What's our vision? And
Yeah.
everything should cascade from that.
Mm.
Um, where I would diverge slightly from Scrum. They take issue with the time-based component in Smart. I still think it's important, but I understand their resistance to it. But more broadly, developing measures, and I think that's where anytime we engage in a research project, the very first thing that we have to do is identify the right problem,
Mm.
right? Because we can run correlations and find that ice cream sales and murder rates are extremely correlated, and then we
Yes.
ban ice cream and people keep dying, right? Um, so
Yes.
we have to identify the right problem, get to the root cause, and from there develop strategy that is informed by humans and informed by human dignity, as well as good policy, right?
Very interesting. What advice would you give to leaders hesitant to adopt AI-driven project management?
I think what I would say is I work with neurodiverse folks a lot. I'm neurodivergent, and my partner is as well. And one of the things that comes along with that is an aversion to new food,
Hmm.
right? And the way that you introduce new food to a neurodivergent child is you first present it as just something separate from the meal experience, right? So
Hmm.
here's a head of cabbage, here's some broccoli, whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and then you gradually incorporate it into the meal experience. So you might put it on the plate, or you might have them smell it, and eventually you might have them try it. Uh,
Mm,
and I think that metaphor carries over. And I'm not saying that we should treat CEOs like children, but I'm saying we should take small steps to decrease their resistance, because a lot of that resistance is based on ignorance. And I
mm.
don't mean that in an ugly way.
Yeah.
I mean ignorance that comes from just a lack of experience, right? We fear the things that we don't know, right?
Mm,
And there are certainly some things with AI that most companies aren't ever going to worry much about deep learning, right?
mm,
It's too big of an investment. There's not as much capacity for an economy of scale there. So when they think about it, instead of thinking about, hey, you have to eat this whole sandwich, right? Take a bite.
mm,
Try to tap out a contract and have a template for a contract that your legal team can review. And now you've saved
mm.
yourself 2 hours of writing boilerplate, right?
Right, right.
If you can sell them on the business case for AI integration and alleviate the fear, and a lot of that fear comes through experiential learning, right?
Mm,
Just like riding a bicycle.
yeah.
Eventually, you develop confidence and you realize that, yeah, it's still dangerous. There are still
Mm,
some things that could happen, but generally speaking, if I follow the rules of the road and I make informed choices about how I ride, I'm going to have a good experience.
amazing. I want to now ask you a question about your book, Casey, book titled Targeting Discretion. Tell me about your book and what was your hypothesis when you wrote this book?
Well, I have to dig back into history because the book actually came out of a larger project. And
Hmm.
so, for my dissertation back in the Stone Age, when I rode my dinosaur to class,
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
the National Association of Counties gave me a grant to study the decision-making pattern differences between county sheriffs and elected county sheriffs and appointed municipal police chiefs.
Mm,
And I devised some scenarios and
mm,
conducted quasi experiments where I went out and conducted interviews and then compared responses.
mm,
And this is really an area where grounded theory is took place. So, in the course of interviewing these people about decision making, I saw these patterns emerge. And what I noticed is the typical police officer is trained in the United States to think about discretion as a donut. And
mm,
in that hole, in the donut hole, is where discretion resides. And that comes from Ronald Dworkin's 1977 book, Taking Right Seriously. Um, I like it because discretion is constrained by something, but it doesn't give us the ability to appreciate the independent influence of all
mm,
the factors that relate to discretion, and it doesn't allow us to compare their relative influence, right? So the target that I came up with is an expansion of that donut. We add rings. There are 9 rings, and so within there we would find all of those accountability dimensions, SOPs, informal organizational norms, personal
mm,
values, et cetera, et cetera. And the idea is very simply, people go and they rank their priorities when it comes to making decisions.
mhm,
And most of the research has been comparing frontline officers with command staff members, right?
mm,
And the beauty of this is it gives some perspective, right? This isn't to go in and fix. And I don't believe in being a colonist and coming or a colonializer and coming in and
mhm.
trying to fix, right? I want to come in and listen, and that's the human-centered design part. I
Right.
want to come in and listen and empower the people to solve their
Mm,
own problems. So what this enables is conversations about differences in priorities.
mm,
Now, I'll give you a pretty quick example. So imagine you have a police chief who hasn't been on the street doing
mm,
patrol in 20 years.
mm.
They might have a completely different view of the community that's based
Correct.
on what their experience was and what the
Mm.
norms of that community are.
Yeah.
The frontline officers, on the other hand, who are there in real time, are going to have completely different real time perspectives. So, taking the chief on a ride along and helping them to see through the eyes of the frontline staff, and it
Mm.
works the other way too, right?
Yeah.
So, these frontline officers that don't understand the political pressures coming from the mayor or the council, maybe they start showing up to a couple of city council meetings so they understand what the chief is facing. And
Mm.
that mutual empathy, it's really pinned on Mary Parker Follett's notion of interpenetration. So
Mm.
being able to get inside the minds of your manager and have that manager get inside your mind and let the situation dictate the action rather than the order.
Mm.
And so it's been sort of a framework that has enabled strategic planning initiatives. I've done research on a diverse set of elements there. So the last article I published was out of that data was an analysis of a majority minority city and
Hmm.
the racial composition of its police force and the implications there.
Mm.
So there's lots that can be done with it. It's kind of a workhorse
Yeah.
for single case study analysis, for aggregate analysis. And the beauty of it is now that I'm trained in disciplined agile, I can see how it blends in almost perfectly. So the next step with this model and the next book is going to be Target 2.0, and it's going to be more expanded to public and nonprofit applications beyond
Wow.
law enforcement.
Wow. And maybe we'll schedule a conversation about your book when you're ready to
Sure
publish
thing.
it. But on that note, Casey, I just want to say what an amazing conversation this has been. I mean, I think I've learned lots of interesting new things from you today, and I'm sure my viewers and listeners have done the same. It's incredible how you have been able to uh, so easily explain to us how AI is becoming a part of managing projects and leadership. We covered some very interesting ground on some of the common pitfalls, what are some of the best practices, how AI powered tools help education. We spoke a little bit about human centric management. We spoke about governance, evidence based governance. And of course, we spoke about your book, Targeting Discretion. Thank you for speaking to me and good luck to you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.